Hi folks, I'm Steve and this is a video about how I paint my Nighthaunt Chainrasps from GW. You'll see I add quite a bit of physical texture to the models and I will be doing a video on how I go about that, but today it's just about my process for painting these guys, so let's crack on. The first few steps are done with an airbrush, but you can just as easily do them by hand. I just like to get through them in a batch and find that the airbrush is the quickest way of doing that. The models have already been primed with a zenithal prime, and then the first step is to get the shadow on, and I do that using a kind of turquoise colour that I made from mixing my darkest blue and darkest green together in a 50-50 ratio, and I'm just getting that on to the model from taking a downward angle, so it's getting into all the shadows and the crevices. After the shadows, the next step is to come in with a lighter colour, spraying top down. For this I'm using a yellow ochre colour. This one is Desert Yellow from Army Painter. You don't need to use the specific paints or anything that I'm using, use whatever range you have and paints you have. But I will list the paints that I've used in the info below the video, just in case you're interested. And this last bit that I'm doing with the airbrush, I'm using a very dark brown. There's very little white, so it's almost transparent, and it's watered down quite a lot with some flow improver. Just spraying this on, making sure it goes into the shadows, and the overlap really doesn't matter because this brown, I believe it's Bulk Brown from Army Painter, it's just going to help tie in the transition between all the different colours and just tone it all down a little bit, mute it, and so it'll look really nice when it's done. So this is where I start coming in with the brush. First I'm going to work on the skull and the arms. The colour I'm using is Army Painter Skeleton Bone, and it's really quite dilute on my palette, and so I'm just taking some of it on my brush and I'm using a stifling or a sort of dabbing motion, and I'm just letting that paint go on in little concentrated and controlled dots where I want it to go on the model. It dries very quickly because of how thin it is, so I'm just working on it and I'm just going over in little dots here and there, working that paint on, and like I said, it is really thin. And so I just continue moving my way around the model, putting the paint on where I want it. Like I said, this is the hands, the skull, and I'm just working it up with really thin layers, really thin dots, until I'm happy with it. Once I'm happy with that colour, I'm going to take my next one, which is it's an off-white. It's Army Painter's Mummy Robes, which is basically a white, and I'm going to use a little bit of that to take it up even higher and start working that over a smaller reduced section of the areas that I've already highlighted using the skeleton bone. And here I'm working on the lower part of the robes, which are going to have an off-white colour. So again, I'm going back to the Mummy Robes colour, and I'm starting off with it really thin down. It's very much close to a glaze consistency. Getting it onto the model, moving it around, kind of starting towards the bottom where I'm going to want it to be the brightest, moving upwards, and I'm repeatedly passing with that very thin paint. I'm letting it build. It's creating this kind of look of texture from the layers of paint we've got underneath, so I don't want it too thick, too opaque, where it's going to wash that away and remove all the shading that we've already put in. So I'm really just building it bit by bit, and I'm going to, I've got to dilution of it on my palette, where it's slightly thicker to one side and more dilute to the other, and I'm switching between the two so I can use the thicker paint when I'm down at the bottom and at the edges, the sharp angles, things like that that are going to catch the light, and use the thinner dilution of the paint as I work further up the model towards where the natural shadows of it are going to be, because I don't want it to be too bright up there. Here on the back of the model you can really see how I'm working that white, having it much stronger towards the bottom, towards the edges of the robe, working it up slightly just in a much more diluted fashion, coming back where I need to boost that white, to use the less diluted side of the paint that I've got on my palette, just playing around with it until I'm building it up to a point where I'm happy, where the edges are brighter, the folds are darker, and just so we're getting that contrast there. Now onto the wood on the model, and I'm using a leather brown colour for this. I've started off by just desaturating it a little bit by adding a little bit of green, a little bit of bone, just to tone it down, get that over most of the wood first, and then after that I'm going to go back to the original leather brown colour and start working that up and building that in the where the higher points will be on the model, where the wood's going to have more light hitting it, and where it's going to have a bit more depth to it. And here I am going in with the undiluted leather brown, just hitting up the parts like the top side of the haft of the axe and the top edge of the wood. And with that out of the way, I'm going to start on the metallics, and for this model I want it to be a really weathered, rusty looking metal, whether it's iron or steel, whatever it might be. So the base colour, I made a mix. It was a gunmetal colour. It was Cote Chainmail, and that's mixed in with a copper colour from Army Painter, and a little bit of the leather brown, and also a little bit of the green as well, just to darken it down a little bit. And I did a slight dab of orange to give it this kind of rusty look. And so I'm just going to start by getting that all over all the bits that are going to be metallic, so the chains, the axe head, the nail on his plank of wood, all those bits, get them covered with that first. And I made a small mistake there and managed to get some of the metallic paint onto his hand. It was just a little spot, so I just quickly got a damp brush and just wiped it off, so it's really easy to correct little mistakes like that. At this point I wanted to give the upper parts of the model, those robes, a quick dry brush, just to bring out the texture a little bit more that I put on it. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I will do a tutorial about how I add different kinds of textures and bits and pieces to models. But yeah, for this one I just wanted to get a little bit of a highlight there just to pick it out, the raised areas. And so I took the bone colour and just did a very gentle dry brush over the majority of the material that I'd put on, just to pick it out, because we will be putting a wash on at one point later on, and I want to make sure that it still all stands out, that texture that I've added. And here I'm going to start the weathering on the metal on the model, and there are loads of different ways of doing this. For this I'm doing quite a simple one. I've got a paint called Dry Rust from Army Painter, and at the moment what I'm doing is just picking out little spots and areas on the metal on the model, on the various metallic areas, and I'm putting little dabs of it. You use this paint quite thick, and it dries and it gives you a nice orange colour, and there's also a bit of a texture to it as well, which I quite like. So I'm just going to go around the model putting this on. I really like to go pretty heavy with the rust and patina, with things like that on the metallics for the Nighthaunt. I think it complements really well the darker earthy tones that I have on the rest of the model, so I really like the metallics to look ancient and used, and to stand out from the rest of the model, which is why I throw quite a bit on it in terms of the rust and the Nihilakh oxide. But I think the overall effect is really good at the end. Here I am going in with the Nihilakh oxide, pretty much the same idea as the dry rust that I've just put on, same kind of areas. I just like the additional contrast it provides, having that kind of bluey green against the orange. Now I'm getting to putting some blood stains on the robes, on the lower white robes. For that I've just used, I've got one red that I've used, I'm mixing in a little bit of green, a little bit of brown, just to get some variation, and it's just a case of small blobs, little dots here and there, and working over them. So I might start with one of the darker mixes that I've got with the green and brown in it, and then gradually put a few of the lighter colours of red that I've mixed onto it, just so each little patch of blood just has a bit of variation on it, so it's not all just one colour. Then back to the metallics, I'm going to put a bit of a highlight on. For this it was Army Painter Plate Mail, which is quite a nice shiny metallic colour, and so I'm just going around catching the edges, like the edges of the axe head, things like that, anything that I want to have the light hit it and give it a bit of a glint. That will get toned down again once we put the wash on. Now I'm at the stage where I'm going to apply some oil washes to the model. I'm going to start with Burnt Umber, and this is just diluted down with some white spirit, and I'm brushing this onto all the upper part of the model, the robes that have got the texture on, and the bone and the hands as well. The second part of the oil wash is going to be a black oil wash, and this is really thinned down with white spirit because black oil paints are really strong. This is going to go over all the metallic parts, and also on the white robes at the bottom and on the base as well. The texture on the base I did paint with a sort of dark grey colour called Dark Stone by Army Painter previously, and I'm just going to get the oil wash over that as well, just so it goes into the crevices there and darkens that. Once the oil paint has dried, I'm going to then go in with a brush that's just slightly dampened with white spirit, and I'm going to actually I'm going to take off some parts of that oil paint where it's settled, the higher parts, the edges, things like that. I'm just going to gently brush against them with the brush with the white spirit on it, and that's just going to remove a portion of that, just so you can see the paint underneath and it looks a bit brighter, it lifts it up. At this point, just a final touch up of the metallics. I'm just going back in with the plate mail colour from earlier, and I'm just going to boost the highlights a little bit just on the very edges and points that I really want that to stand out. And then the final part of this is, of course, to paint the rim of the base black. Probably one of my favourite parts of painting. I really like how the model just seems to come together once you've done that final finishing touch. I always find it very satisfying, really enjoy that. And here is the finished model. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, hopefully it was useful for you as well. Please feel free to give me your feedback in the comments. It's always helpful to find out what people like and what people don't like, so let me know. Thanks very much, bye now.